Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Ben Jones. He is the Assistant Director of the Rock Ethics Institute at Penn State University. He does work in political philosophy and applied ethics, focusing on criminal justice, political ethics, ideal theory, and religion's role in politics. Today we will be talking about the death penalty, and especially the case against it. Before we dive into this kind of somber topic, I'd like to ask you, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Maybe one thing is that it's not necessary to have super strong ideological commitments. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, am I liberal, libertarian, Marxist? And I guess as I sort of struggled with that, one thing I came to realize is that the world is incredibly complex, and more complex than any particular ideology can fully capture. And so inevitably you come across new information, new evidence, and that's going to put any ideology, raise questions about it. And I think when you confront that, it's important to revise your beliefs in light of the new evidence, rather than just doggedly trying to hang on to a particular ideology.
I think that's a good response. I mean, I always whenever I learn new stuff, I have to go back, reevaluate, kind of grow in a way. Like I'm always learning new stuff, kind of altering what I think and questioning it. So I think that's good. Okay, so let's get started with some statistics. 28 states in the United States have the death penalty, and so far in 2020, 6 prisoners have been executed, I think. But my question is the U.S. unique among developed nations for regular use of the death penalty?
We are pretty unique. You see, during the last half of the 20th century, there was very strong movement against the death penalty nationwide. So you see Europe gets rid of the death penalty, Canada gets rid of the death penalty, a bunch of other countries get rid of it. And the countries that still use the death penalty with regularity are China, Iran, Pakistan, United States, and the United States likes to see itself as a leader on human rights issues. But when it comes to the death penalty, it's increasingly marginalized in its position. And that there's a difference. Things could have turned out differently, because if you look back at the history of the death penalty, in 1972, in a Supreme Court case, Furman v. Georgia, the United States Supreme Court struck down the death penalty. And at the time, it seemed that the United States was sort of moving in conjunction with where the rest of the world was going on the death penalty. But what you have is that 4 years later, the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty. And because of that position, because of the expanded use of the death penalty in the immediate decades after that, the United States became increasingly an outlier on the issue.
Why did the death penalty come back? Is there any specific reason why the Supreme Court went back and reinstated it?
Yeah, so the Furman decision was in 1972, and there was a lot of backlash to it across the United States, and in particular among conservatives and folks that were emphasizing law, sort of a law and order message. And if you go back to the 1970s, that's when you're seeing the start of the war on drugs. There were rising crime rates around this period, which made people increasingly worried. And it became a very potent political message that if you are tough on crime, if you need to support the death penalty, that these two go hand in hand. And for decades and decades, politicians felt compelled to take this position that they were tough on crime. And it started off in the Republican Party, but also migrated to the Democrats. You go to the 1990s, when Bill Clinton was president, passed a number of very severe crime bills during the 1990s under Democratic leadership, including bills that expanded the use of the death penalty. So that really helped expand the death penalty's use and bring it back. And today we're wrestling with that history, not just with the death penalty, but with the criminal justice system generally, because we have mass incarceration. We have all these policies in place that are costing lots of money, that aren't making communities that much safer, that are particularly harsh in terms of their impacts on people who get caught up in the criminal justice system. They're plagued by racial disparities. And the death penalty is the most severe manifestation of these policies because it takes away someone's life.
Before we go further into the argument against the death penalty and evidence for that, there are a lot of states that have it, but they don't use it at all. Like Mississippi still has it, but it hasn't executed anyone since 2012. And California, Pennsylvania, and Oregon have gubernatorial moratoriums. But if they have it but don't use it, why not abolish it altogether?
I think they should do that exactly. What you see is that oftentimes for a state to get to abolition, it's a gradual process. You find that a state moves away from it's not used that often. People come to recognize that, oh, hey, we cannot use the death penalty, and things are okay. The sky doesn't fall. And when you have this system in place, that you're not executing people, it's usually still pretty expensive, because to seek a death sentence, a capital case and trial are extremely expensive, more so than if you're not seeking the death penalty. And so I think a lot of states, they move away from it. They see that the system isn't working, that it's a albatross on their budgets and criminal justice system, and then eventually they get to abolition. And I think, look at, for instance, Washington State. Washington State got rid of the death penalty. Both Washington State and Colorado got rid of the death penalty in recent years. They both had moratoria in place before they ended the death penalty. So a moratorium just means it's still on the books, it's still in law, but the governor has declared that they're not going to execute anyone. So it's a gradual process. One thing I should also point out about the different uses of the death penalty between states is that even when you look at states that do use the death penalty, Georgia, Florida, Texas, it's not all the counties within those states. It's usually just a handful of counties that are driving death sentences and executions. And if you look nationwide, just 2% of counties are responsible for over 50% of executions and over 50% of death sentences. So a lot of these decisions come down to individual district attorneys on whether or not they're going to seek the death penalty or not. And a lot of district attorneys have made the decision that, well, this just really doesn't make sense, but you still get a few that are very gung-ho in their use of the death penalty.
Wow. I mean, That's kind of crazy. Like, I didn't really realize how few districts did it. Like, I knew there was kind of a divide between like states that did it, but the fact that it's even a few districts, that's kind of wow. I just had no idea. So you wrote a piece at libertarianism.org called "The Libertarian Case Against the Death Penalty," where you state that based on evidence and philosophy that libertarians shouldn't support the death penalty, or that just the death penalty doesn't really go well with libertarian theory. So let's kind of go into that evidence and kind of talk about that. So, my first question about this is, does the death penalty reduce the likelihood of violent crime? Does data suggest that it's possible for the death penalty to reduce violent crime, or like the likelihood of it altogether?
So the case that the death penalty is a deterrent is based on what seems like a straightforward idea that the death penalty is a harsher sentence than some sort of imprisonment, and therefore, if a potential criminal is considering their options and they see, oh, I could get executed for this, then they'll be more discouraged from committing the crime. So that's the general theory. And I mean, you can imagine cases where it's pretty obvious the death penalty would be a deterrent if you implemented the death penalty for parking violations. I imagine that parking violations would drop dramatically. But the relevant question is, does the death penalty deter crime over and above what the alternative sentence would be, which across the US tends to be life in prison without parole? And there's not much evidence that it does. And sort of what's called a meta study, which looks at all the different deterrent studies out there, what sort of the best ones have found is that there's really no compelling evidence that the death penalty has an impact on murder rates one way or the other. So why would that be the case? I think there's some good explanations why. Generally, in deterrence theory, for a particular sentence to be an effective deterrent, it needs to be swift and it needs to be certain. And the death penalty is neither of those. When you look at how the death penalty is applied, the percentage of cases where the death penalty ends up being the sentence is pretty small. Also, if a death sentence is put in place, it can take decades before it's carried out. There are hundreds and hundreds of people that are on death row in the United States where it's taken decades, where they've been there for decades without an execution taking place. So given that this is how the system functions, it would be surprising if there was a very strong deterrent effect. And one thing to keep in mind is there is pretty compelling evidence that the death penalty costs more than the alternative of imprisoning someone. So we're putting all this money into this sentence that doesn't have much of an effect on crime, and all that money could be going towards more effective measures to reduce crime. So it's sort of, there are multiple reasons to conclude that the death penalty is a very poor tool for reducing crime.
In your piece, you also cite Edward Crane, who is the founder of Cato Institute, and he explained that, quote, "The government is often so inept and corrupt that innocent people might die as a result. Thus, I personally oppose the death penalty," end quote. And based on research and evidence, scholars have shown that the decision-making process that government follows suffers from a lot of flaws, like no matter what area you look at. And it's often like influenced by interest groups and not really like sound statistics or economics, and that it leads to failures and that they don't have much accountability. Would you say that the same problems with government would apply to the capital punishment system?
Without question. Another another person who has commented on this topic, and I believe you had him on one of your earlier podcasts, is George Will,
Yeah.
and his quote on the death penalty is that it's a government program, so skepticism is in order. And I think there's definitely a role for government in various aspects of life, but you have to make sure that there are some powers that government just shouldn't have, and I think this qualifies um, qualifies. So when you think about the death penalty, it is arguably the greatest power you could give to a government, because it's one thing to take away someone's liberty. It's another thing, after you've removed someone from society, they're no longer a threat, to then give the government the power to kill that person. And so there's skepticism in order, just to begin with, in terms of the, this particular power and the dangerous and the potential for abuse. And when you look at the history of the death penalty throughout the world, in the United States also, you find this power has been abused on a regular basis, where government agents, prosecutors, law enforcement, they suppress evidence. Um, New evidence may emerge that someone's innocent, but instead of recognizing that and trying to rectify the wrong, people fight tooth and nail to execute someone just because they don't want to admit that they were wrong. And so you see this play out time and time again. In the United States, more awareness to these problems really started emerging in the late 1990s. You had DNA evidence being used more often in criminal cases. This DNA evidence was revealing that some people who had been sentenced to death, in fact, were innocent. And there became a growing awareness that this system is far from infallible. In fact, mistakes occur on a regular basis. Some studies suggest that around 4% of people that are wrongfully sentenced to death are, in fact, innocent. So, with an error rate that high, are we really comfortable keeping this system in place, which involves an irrevocable penalty? When you make a mistake and you execute the wrong person, there's not much you can do to fix it.
Do you know the number of people who have been proven innocent that were on death row so far?
Yeah, so we have the figure for the modern era of the death penalty. So that goes back to 1973, um, when people started getting sentenced to death again after it had been struck down. So from 1973 to the present, there are 170 individuals who have been sentenced to death and later exonerated.
And I would say that's for the lucky ones that are actually, like, someone looks back at their case or like anything. Because, I mean, there are that many people who were innocent. How many people, or that were proven innocent, then how many people actually were innocent? I
Yeah,
don't know.
that's a great point, because if someone gets executed, what interest does the government have in going back and looking at evidence and saying, "Oh, look, we made a mistake"? Oftentimes there's a lot of effort put into not investigating old cases, especially if the person was executed and there's not much the government can do to fix it.
Well, because killing someone, you can't really go back and like bring them back. If that's like a final mistake, I don't. That just, I don't know. I feel like I would just not be able to live with myself if I like realized I made some sort of mistake that cost someone their life. I don't know. But so there's this case earlier this year where a man in Oklahoma who was convicted of killing his wife and four children in 1993 was taken off of death row because a U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that he is, quote, intellectually disabled as a matter of law and therefore constitutionally ineligible for execution, end quote. How common is it to put people mentally disabled people on death row?
It's incredibly common. So there's the history on this in terms of the courts. A very important Supreme Court decision happened in 2002, Atkins v. Virginia. And in that decision, the Supreme Court said that it was unconstitutional, it was a violation of the Eighth Amendment, which bans cruel and unusual punishment, to execute someone with intellectual disability. Now, that was a step forward in terms of putting some restrictions on that, because before that it was very, very common to execute people with severe intellectual disability. That hasn't solved the problem, though, because now the debate is, well, where do we draw the line with regards to intellectual disability? And there's still a lot of discretion left up to the states in terms of where to draw that line. And unsurprisingly, some states, especially those that execute individuals quite frequently, like to have a very sort of narrow definition of intellectual disability. And this is still an issue that continues to come up in the courts, continues to be litigated. And it highlights sort of a broader problem with the death penalty. Since the court brought back the death penalty in 1976, it is made very clear that the death penalty isn't just for anyone who commits murder. It has to be for particularly heinous murders. And one thing that the court that juries have to consider are mitigating circumstances. So they're aggravating circumstances and mitigating ones. So the aggravating ones are, what are the features of this crime that make it particularly heinous and worthy of the harshest penalty? But then you look at mitigating factors. Well, what are factors from the defendant's background that may lessen culpability? What sort of intellectual disabilities may they have, or what sort of trauma did they suffer growing up? And making these distinctions have proved incredibly difficult. And so what you find is that you look at, someone gets executed, you look at the facts in the case, and then you look at another case where someone doesn't get executed, and it's like, well, what's the difference here? Why did this person get the death penalty and this person did not? And you actually find sort of a number of legal experts and judges throwing up their hands and saying, we've tried to make these distinctions and we have just failed. And so there's a really famous quote from Justice Harry Blackmun. He was on the court when it brought back the death penalty in 1976. A couple decades later, in a famous dissent, he says, "I shall no longer tinker with the machinery of death." And he was basically communicating the point that for decades we've been trying to get this right and trying to put standards in place where there's some justifiable reason why a certain group of defendants are getting the death penalty and others are not. And he was saying, we can't do this. We've just failed.
Wow. I mean, yeah, I understand how that can be such a difficult thing to discern and to kind of like see, which makes me think it's probably easier if we just don't even have that option. I don't know. But so now can you tell us about some very problematic or controversial executions that have taken place in the US and how they illustrate why you're against the death penalty?
I'll start out with one case. Are you interested in executions, or are you also interested in just death sentences too?
Either. It's whatever you think is most relevant or important.
So I'll start out with a death sentence, and then I'll also share a recent execution. So there were two individuals in North Carolina, Henry McCollum and Leon Brown, who were sentenced to death for it was a very horrific crime. 11-year-old girl was raped and murdered. Understandably, there was outcry in the community to this case. They were sentenced to death. They were both very young. One was 15, the other 19 at the time of the crime. They also both had intellectual disability, so they were vulnerable, in a very vulnerable position, and they were sentenced to death. And that quote I brought up before about Harry Blackman saying he will no longer tinker with the machinery of death, when he issued that dissent, it prompted a response from another justice, Justice Antonin Scalia. And Scalia, who was a strong proponent of the death penalty throughout his time on the court, he pushed back against Blackman's dissent, and he said, and he brought up a case. He brought up this case from North Carolina where this 11-year-old girl was raped and murdered. And he said, it would not be cruel and unusual punishment to put these people to death who did this horrific crime, and specifically Harry McCollum and Leon Brown. So that was in the 90s when this back and forth occurred between Blackman and Scalia. You go a few decades forward, I believe it's 2014, they were exonerated. New DNA evidence comes out. It shows that Brown and McCollum were not the murderers of this young girl, but instead DNA matched another individual who lived a block away, who had a long history of sexual assaults. And so it was pretty clear that they were innocent. And I think this case, it highlights the hubris that infects our death penalty and why we keep making all these mistakes. I mean, Scalia was certain beyond a shadow of a doubt that these people deserved the death penalty. And this was an incredibly problematic case. These individuals had intellectual disability, and the evidence against them was questionable. But I think what made people so certain that they deserved the death penalty was the specifics of the crime. And so when there's a horrific crime that happens in the community and then law enforcement say, hey, look, we caught the people, a lot of times the immediate reaction is, oh, they have to be guilty. And in this case, the evidence was highly questionable. Beyond just Scalia using this case as one to demonstrate the need for the death penalty, McCollum's mugshot was used in campaign ads to attack people for being candidates for being soft on crime. And so the death penalty, this case, I think, shows how the death penalty just seeps into all these other aspects of life and politics, and in really negative and counterproductive ways. Fortunately, DNA evidence eventually came out, and they were found innocent and they were released. But as we talked about earlier, how many other cases are there out there where there isn't that evidence available to show that someone's innocent?
That's wow. I don't know. That's kind of crazy, but also I'm kind of sad how I'm not surprised that they were wrongfully convicted, which is so sad. But I mean, at least they caught the right person in the end, even if it took longer. But is it worth putting those two who were innocent through that entire process when they were innocent? I don't know.
Yeah. And there also been executions that have happened. And so, one of the executions I talk about in the article you mentioned is that of Carlos de Luna. De Luna was executed in the 1980s. He maintained his innocence throughout, and he said, you have the wrong Carlos. It's someone else you're looking for. And investigators just dismissed him. You're making up things. You're just trying to get out of this crime you committed. There was a murder at a gas station, and so that's what he was brought in for. But it turns out, and this investigation came out years later, that there was another um, Carlos Hernandez, that looked very similar to DeLuna. He also Hernandez had admitted to committing other crimes. He had actually admitted to this particular murder that DeLuna was sentenced to death for. He also had a long history of violence. And so all this came out years later, and a team at Columbia University produced a very detailed report making a very compelling case that DeLuna was innocent. But this came out, years later, and there's nothing to do now to bring DeLuna back. Now, this was in the 1980s, and I think some people may say, well, the death penalty was problematic, and we made a lot of mistakes, but with new science and technology, I'm sure we don't make as many mistakes now. To push back on that, I would just look at the most recent execution here in the United States. Walter Barton was an individual who was executed in Missouri back in May. He's so far the only execution that we've had since COVID-19 was declared a pandemic. This was a case where there was very little physical evidence connecting him to a crime. There was an elderly woman who was stabbed 50 times. It was a very gruesome murder.
Oh, man.
And there was a drop of blood that was found on his shirt. And so that was used to connect him to the crime. And
was it her blood?
Yes, it was. I believe that the evidence showed it was her blood. And what the investigators said was this was blood splatter from the crime. So, someone was stabbing the victim, this blood would have splattered and gotten on his shirt. But what everyone agrees of what is agreed upon is that there's a group of people that found the body, and he was there among those who found the body, and a family member had gone towards the body, and he pulled the family member back. And so the explanation is that blood sort of transferred at that moment, which is a very logical explanation. And so the only physical evidence really connecting him was this drop of blood, which subsequent investigators have concluded that it wasn't blood splatter. That's not how it was transferred. So that was the one piece of evidence against him, and the other piece of evidence was a jailhouse informant, and a large body of evidence has shown how unreliable they are. And so these were the pieces of evidence against him. The Innocence Project and other groups were calling for the governor of Missouri not to go forward with his execution, given all the doubts around it. But he was executed in May. And so problematic cases aren't just relegated to the distant past, they're still happening today.
That sounds awful. Like, that is just, man, I cannot imagine. Ugh. But do you have any final pieces of evidence against the death penalty before we move on to philosophical arguments against it?
Yeah, one thing I would add, and this is a concern that people have with the criminal justice system generally, are problems of racial bias and racial disparities. And this has been a problem throughout the death penalty's use in the United States. If you go back to the era of slavery, you find that these disparities were in law, where there were states in the South that they'd have one capital crime for whites, murder, but they'd have dozens and dozens of crimes that black slaves could be executed for. And so you have these disparities written into the law during the era of slavery. The passage of the 14th Amendment at the end of the Civil War required those laws to be changed, but you still find de facto disparities during the era of Jim Crow. So especially for the crime of rape, for instance, it was largely just reserved for African Americans accused of raping white women.
Mhm.
And you have, I think, in the South, around 75% of the individuals who were executed during the era of Jim Crow were African Americans, but only less than a quarter of the population were African Americans. And then today, these disparities still continue. And the most notable way that they continue is the impact that the race of the victim has on death sentences and executions. So prosecutors are much more likely to seek the death penalty when the victim is white than if the victim is black, and they're particularly likely to seek the death penalty if the victim is white and the defendant is an African American. So this is, at this moment where there rightly calls for addressing disparities in the criminal justice system, the death penalty continues to embody these disparities that are deeply problematic.
I actually meant to ask you about um how race played into how the death penalty was is, I guess, because it's still a thing, but I kind of like got swept up in everything else and kind of forgot. But that's just that on top of everything else. Like, it is just there's so many problems that are seem to be easily seen and easily pointed at by evidence, and I don't know, just so many things. And the fact that there are so many cases where people have been proved innocent, it just seems, I don't know, it just doesn't make much sense. But
The one positive in all this, you look
mhm,
at policing today, and there's understandably many concerns over policing and a lot of debate on how do we fix policing in America. Policing is an incredibly complex problem, and I think there's a wide range of different policies and reforms that states and federal government and local governments need to tackle. The death penalty, fixing the death penalty is not that complex. All you got to do is get rid of it. And
yeah.
a number of states have done that. Sky has not fallen. They're doing just fine. And it is one of those issues that, despite all the many problems that plague it, the way to fix it is so straightforward.
That kind of makes me pretty optimistic, at least, that if people kind of, I mean, they seem to have opened their eyes before, and if they kind of, if we put our attention back on that in addition to like other things in the criminal justice system, then that is like an easy step forward we could take.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's talk about kind of the libertarian case against the death penalty on top of all of the evidence. In your piece, you say that the government's record in administering the death penalty should be enough to reject the use of it, but what does libertarian theory say about the death penalty? And let's start with kind of what you would call like the classic libertarian defense against the death. I guess not defense, but it's like, yeah,
The classic libertarian position to basically get rid of the death penalty.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, no. So I think you start out, what's the purpose of government? And the purpose of government is to protect, as the Declaration of Independence says, to protect certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And the most fundamental of those rights is the right to life, because if you don't have life, you know, you can't, you won't have any liberty, and you won't be able to pursue happiness. So there's the strongest burden on government to be able to give a reason why it's taking someone's life.
Mhm.
And you look at, okay, why would the government want to execute people? Well, it could make the case, well, we need this for public safety. We need the death penalty to keep society safe. as we've already discussed, the evidence is not particularly strong on that point. Really, the only, is it from a cost-effective perspective? Does it make sense? No, it doesn't make sense. It also, it's an irrevocable penalty. It's one you can't fix if you make a mistake. All these different criteria, the death penalty falls short. And basically, if you're going to make the case for the death penalty, you end up sort of the only ground you can use is the retributivist ground. The idea that if someone commits a horrible murder, they should be executed. That is the only punishment that is justifiable for them. And you can make that argument, but you also have to accept all the collateral damage that comes with that you're going to execute some innocent people, that you're going to be wasting all this money on a program that doesn't keep people that safe, that could go towards more effective measures. You're also going to have in place a legal system that's incredibly drawn out, because, I mean, unless you're just going to execute people super quickly, then the mistakes are going to be more likely. But if you're going to have a lengthy appeals process, that often can be difficult on murder victims' family members who keep having to come back to court again and again. So the question is, is the retributive argument enough to justify all these other problems that come with the death penalty? And ultimately, that's a decision that each of us has to make when evaluating the practice. From my perspective, no. I think we all have retributive impulses to a certain degree, but is retribution really worth putting innocent lives at risk? I don't think so.
Because even in a system like that, like an eye for an eye, a life for a life, you don't know if people are innocent or not, but also will that make you feel less guilty or less sad or anything? Probably not. I don't know. It just, yeah. Plus, how I feel like there are so many mistakes, it doesn't really address the fact that there are mistakes in the system. Mistakes that legislators make, or even attorneys or just judges and juries and stuff. I don't know. But are there any circumstances under which the data might cause you to favor, or at least not oppose, the death penalty? Like, if there were 100 studies that were really well done that showed that the death penalty reduced violent crimes by 50% annually or something like that, would you still oppose it?
The thing is, if you were to find that the death penalty, I have a hard time imagining a scenario where I would change my mind, because I think to get to the point where the death penalty had this huge deterrent effect, you'd have to be using it way more frequently with far fewer due process protections in place for defendants. So basically, to get to a point where the death penalty could have this huge deterrent effect, you'd be executing a lot more innocent people who don't deserve to be executed. And so I think that's the inevitable trade-off you would end up with, and I wouldn't be comfortable with that. Plus you can look at so many other countries around the world that don't have the death penalty and have far lower murder rates than we do. So I'm pretty confident that you can design a criminal justice system, keep society secure, without having to resort to the death penalty.
Plus, I feel like it isn't cost effective. I mean, I don't know the numbers or anything, but I feel like I've read in a lot of places that it costs way less to put someone in jail for life without parole than to give the death penalty. And even though it's become more cost effective, it's still not really.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. I mean, the main reason why is that lawyers are more expensive than prison guards. And what the Supreme Court has said is that if you're going to seek the death penalty, you have to meet a higher burden to be able to sentence them to death. So not only do you prove that they committed a capital crime, but you have to have this second phase of the trial where you have to show that aggravating factors outweigh mitigating factors. And so that doing that preparation, that part of the trial adds hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars more to cases where the death penalty is sought versus cases where it is not sought. And you look at this, just adds up in different states. I mean, California, a study found that it had spent billions of dollars on its death penalty, billions with a B, since it brought it back in the 1970s. And the question is that really worth it?
Can you tell us about the popular opinion about the death penalty? How is it changing and how does it break down by political affiliation or age?
Yeah, so death penalty public opinion has changed quite a bit since the mid 90s. In the mid 90s, you see support for the death penalty around 80%. It was incredibly popular. Democrats and Republicans were together calling for the death penalty, expanding its use. And then in the late 1990s, early 2000s, you have all these cases that pop up of innocent individuals sentenced to death row and being exonerated, sometimes by DNA evidence. And that really prompted a lot of individuals to rethink the death penalty. And you see support for the death penalty decline. So whereas it was around 80% in the mid 90s, it's now around 55%. And so if you ask people, do you support the death penalty for the crime of murder? You have around 55% who say they do. Now, if you ask people, do you support the death penalty or life in prison without parole? Support for the death penalty drops even more. The most recent poll showed that 60% favored life in prison without parole over the death penalty. And within sort of how this breaks down, depending on political party, today a strong majority of Democrats are against the death penalty. That is a pretty significant shift since the 1990s. You still have majorities of Republicans who support the death penalty, though that has declined a bit. African Americans tend to be very strongly against the death penalty. Younger people more against the death penalty than older people. If you look at the parties in the United States, the Libertarian Party, the Democratic Party, the Green Party, they all have planks against the death penalty. For the Libertarian Party and the Democratic Party, that was relatively recently, I believe in 2016. So the only sort of major party that still has a pro-death penalty plank is the Republican Party.
Interesting. Any last words on the death penalty?
I would just say there's reason for optimism in terms of, I mean, though it's at least from my perspective, it's discouraging that the death penalty still has it. You see strong movement against it in recent decades. So in the past 15 years, 10 states have abolished the death penalty. You have 3 more states that have a moratorium on executions. Executions have gone down dramatically. You had, in the late 1990s, close to 100 executions per year. That has dropped to just a few dozen, even less than that. And death sentences are going down. So when you look at all the major trends, death sentences per year, executions per year, number of states that have the death penalty, they're all going in the direction of abolition. So that's reason for hope.
That sounds pretty good to me. I mean, who knows how long it'll take, but it's still happening. So, finally, What is something you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
So this is very relevant to this podcast, the death penalty. I grew up supporting the death penalty. I remember in high school making arguments with my friends for the death penalty. And as I dug into the evidence, I increasingly found myself unable to support it. And that led me to change my position and then um, become active in efforts to end it and research it. So it is a great example of someone changing their mind.
That is a good example. Plus, I mean, then you put that like in a megaphone with this podcast episode. It's like, see how much I changed my mind? Here's an episode to prove it. Yeah, that's interesting. That's cool. I had no idea that you opposed it when you were younger. That's wow. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being on my podcast. I learned a lot, and I hope my listeners do too. I think they will. I've had a great pleasure talking to you. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much. I enjoyed it.